Hello class and fellow viewers, my name is Colton. Today, I'll be presenting you the life of a Canadian student versus the life of a residential student. Just a disclaimer, we will be talking about heavy subjects like assault and suicide, things like that. So if you don't like those things, click off the video. But without further ado, let's just get right into it. Let's take it all the way back to the beginning with the Canadian student. Day 1, kindergarten. Now usually when you go on your first day, you go either by yourself, with family, with siblings, stuff like that. You bring some cool items to show the kids that you're cool, and you get settled in for your first day of school with new friends and all types of things. Switching over to the residential school student, you go to school with some items, you lose them. You go with siblings, you don't get to see them anymore. When you go to residential school, you start anew. You lose everything. Boys and girls, separated. Older and younger, separated. You do not get to see those close people to you anymore. Your clothes, also taken away. Hair, cut. You don't get to keep long hair. It has to be short. And basically, you start anew. You start from the beginning as a clean slate at the residential school compared to Canadian living, where you go and start not fresh, but with things that you love, not at a residential school. Going back to the Canadian student, but a few years later, you're already in the routine. You get up at 7 and 8 a.m., brush your teeth, get dressed, maybe have a shower to not stink, get some food prepared by mom, get a little lazy in the morning, and then finally send off your family, go to school, and get ready to learn. Now going to the residential school students, you get 5 minutes at 5 a.m. to get dressed, brush your teeth, brush your hair, and get into the line. If you are not in the line, if you are 5 seconds late, you get assaulted, you get beat immediately, the strap immediately. But matters get even worse because Canadian students go to school to learn in the morning, but residential school students get unpaid labor first thing in the morning. Men have to do farm work, females have to do housework because they got segregated as well in residential schools. But we'll talk more about labor later. Now that the morning is over, as a Canadian student, you're finally at school learning math, social studies, science, and the primary main language spoken by Canadians, English. You're taught useful skills for later on in life to help you better yourself in the future, and usually along the way you have teachers there for when you get stuff wrong. They come over to you, guide you along the way to get to the correct answer, and better yourself later on so that you can succeed in school. At around 3 p.m. you finally get to go home, relieved that the day is finally over. Going back to residential students, things were way different. You were not taught your first language. You were taught to discard the first language of the indigenous peoples. You were not allowed to speak indigenous languages, and if you did, you got punished, you got beat. And instead of learning useful skills that would be transferable to real life, all you learned at residential schools was religion and how to speak English. They were not taught anything else useful for later on in life. And rather than being helped to find the right answer, if you got something wrong, you got taken up to the front of the class and whipped in front of everybody until eventually you got the right answer. You were assaulted until you got the right answer. For residential school students, you were not relieved at 3 p.m. The maximum you were relieved at is 9 p.m. if evening school was on for male students. And then all students were forced to repeat that same thing over and over and over again at school the next day. Back to the Canadian student, it's now lunchtime. And you have money to buy something for the cafeteria, maybe go to a store like Señor's to get some pizza. The worst thing that can happen is you get bullied and they steal your lunch money. But that's not the worst thing that can happen at a residential school. At residential schools, most kids did not even have enough money to afford anything to eat at lunch because they never got paid for their labor and the rations given to them were basically nothing. Even if they did get food, most of the time it was expired or it was raw meat that was causing disease and sickness among the students. So you were lucky to even survive lunchtime at a residential school with how the food quality was, and it was horrible. Lunchtime for residential schools was hell compared to how it is for Canadian students, and that just is not right. Going back to the Canadian student, in high school, usually you might have a job after school that you have to go to. It could be like me with the ball depot. You go there for a couple hours, make some money to pad your bank account a little bit after school, and then finally get home to do some resting. Comparing this to indigenous students, you would have to do unpaid labor throughout the day for a maximum of 6 hours a day. Males did farm work and physical labor, whereas women did more housework and needling activities during those hours. Forced gender roles upon all the indigenous peoples that may not have been needed to happen. Keep in mind the indigenous students were malnourished and doing this for no money at all, no personal gain whatsoever. And speaking of, they never got to go home to their families after work. They went straight back to school to do the labor every single day over and over again. Going back to a Canadian student, when school is over, you finally get to go back home, see your family, go to the table, eat dinner, have some great table talk about random events. play some games, maybe just relax a little bit, chill, do homework, and finally get ready for the next day by going to bed all comfy, ready for the next day. Comparing this to residential school students, you were lucky to even see the next day with all the bad things that were happening. You were lucky to even survive to the next day with all the sexual assault, regular assault, and all the cruelties that were happening, like sickness and disease and all those sort of things. You were lucky to even survive the day entirely, let alone get to go home to see your family. Because once you go to residential schools, you resign that ability to see your family. You never get to see them until you graduate from residential schools entirely. Going back to the Canadian student one more time, usually when you graduate, everybody in your life is happy. It's one of the greatest moments of your life, graduating from high school and going into college to better your future, get a job, start a new family, and continue your family on into the future. For residential school students, graduating from residential schools was more of a relief rather than something exciting. It doesn't get any better outside of school, as most residential school students end up committing suicide due to their traumatic experiences within the residential schools, or having children and raising them poorly as they were in residential schools, causing many more problems in the future outside of residential schools in themselves and into problems that we're having to this day. So, for the Canadian student, school was a pathway to success in the future, but for Indigenous peoples, it was a gateway to hell. That was my presentation on the life of a Canadian student versus the life of residential school students. Hopefully this taught you a little bit more about residential schools and the traumatic things that were taking place in those buildings. And I'm hoping that all of us in the future can do something to help reconcile all the actions that we did to the Indigenous peoples in the past, so that in the future they can prosper just as much as us Canadians have done, so that we can all be equal together. That was my presentation, and thank you for watching. Have a great rest of your day.
He's so cute! Oh my god!
Why are you still here? Go away!
Wilson just coughed and farted.
I need an egg. Thank you.
He's eating my car, maybe there's something dead in it.